health level. So with that, I will turn it over to Caleb.
Thank you, Ethan. So I'm Caleb Dresser. I'm an emergency medicine doc at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. And what I'm going to share over the next 10 minutes or so is a little bit of my experience taking care of people during winter weather. When I give this type of talk to other physicians, we're usually talking about how to treat the things we're looking at here. What I want to focus on today and have you come away from this session with is some additional thoughts about how to prevent this sort of thing, because it's far better to not have to come into the emergency department at all. I want to start with falls. So during winter weather, there's a whole lot of snow, there's a whole lot of ice, and there's also a whole lot of bulky clothing, footwear that maybe is just getting pulled out of the closet for the first time in a year. And so we see a pretty significant uptick in falls, sprains, minor injuries, up to major and sometimes catastrophic head injuries. And so the big takeaway I want everyone to have about this is that certain people are at particularly high risk of falls. That might be elderly relatives of yours. That might be someone who lives in the apartment upstairs but still needs to go to the grocery. And so taking a little bit of time to think about who in your life around you would be at a higher risk of a slip and fall on ice or pavement during the winter, you can do a lot to really improve somebody's life by not having to deal with this problem at all, whether that's doing a little bit of grocery shopping for them or taking the time to shovel the snow off their walk. Next slide. The second thing is, speaking of snow shoveling, myocardial infarction or heart attack in common parlance. So this is something that we see increase in cold weather. There's pretty good evidence that snow shoveling, which is really intense cardiovascular exercise, does result in heart attacks for some people. Ways to prevent that include shoveling smaller chunks of snow, smaller bites with the shovel, taking frequent breaks, and maybe having somebody help you with the snow if you're someone who's higher risk for a cardiovascular event. The other piece that is a little bit more difficult to understand, but is also very important, is that simply very cold weather has also been linked with increased risks of heart attacks in a variety of countries around the world. And the idea is that the very cold weather causes blood vessels to constrict and causes an increase in stress on the body, and that both of those things can increase work required of the heart that stresses it out and can lead to heart attacks. So what this means in practice is that when it's very cold out, people who are at higher cardiovascular risk, people who are older, who are smokers, who have lipid or blood pressure problems, need to be making sure they bundle up, might benefit from staying in where it's warm if it's really cold out, and should be asking for help with shoveling snow. Next slide. At the opposite end of things, if you do find yourself outside, hypothermia is something that is really important to be aware of. We often see this in the emergency department in people who've somehow wound up in water. So I had a recent case of someone who wound up in a body of water within the last couple of months and arrived in the emergency department with a core body temperature that was quite low. The person was confused, shivering, didn't make a whole lot of sense. And we warmed them up for a couple of hours and they went home feeling fine. So that's a happy ending to that story, but this is not always what happens. And so particularly if you live in a setting where someone around you has had their heat shut off or doesn't have access to a heated space in which they live, or if there are people around you who maybe for either work reasons or recreational reasons or issues of homelessness may be outside in the cold for extended periods of time, it's important to be aware of these symptoms and understand who might need a hot cup of tea and a blanket and who needs to come to the hospital in an ambulance. The big picture idea being, if they're not making any sense when you talk to them, you should probably come and see me. Next slide. So frostbite is another issue. This is something that was very common and very well known in the era before central heating and in the era when a lot of people worked outside every day. This is a little bit less common in New England now, which is good. We do see this pretty frequently in people who are doing skiing or mountaineering or ice climbing or other outdoor activities that put them outside for a long time. We also see this in people who don't have somewhere warm to stay. So in the homeless population in Boston, this is also a pretty big issue. One of the important things I want people to take away is this pretty unpleasant image, which is just to say that if you're starting to see hands that look the wrong color, it's time to go to the doctor. Because if you try to manage this at home, there's the potential for worsened permanent tissue damage. And so getting people to a warm place with medical attention is the first step. Next slide. So as we think about who's going to get these, I've mentioned some of the risk factors, but this image from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is, I think, a helpful one because it reminds us of a couple of other populations we need to pay attention to. And these may be people we live with, they may be people that are our neighbors or our friends. And these people need someone to check on them because what unites all of the people in this list is they may not have the opportunity to be warm. They may not be in a position to pay their heating bill. They may not be in a position to get to warmth if they're a very small child, for example. And so being alert to who might be more susceptible, more vulnerable is really important. Next slide. On a totally different note, carbon monoxide poisoning is a big issue. This is something we see with some regularity after hurricanes. And it may be that Arlene will speak more to how we prevent this, but we fairly commonly see people in sort of national studies where a hurricane happens, a power outage happens, a winter storm happens, and the power is out and people want to have power. And so they start running generators. And if a generator is outdoors, outside, that usually goes fine. And if the generator is indoors in a house or in a garage, the result is often tragic because carbon monoxide is not something you can see, taste, or smell. And the symptoms are very vague, sort of mild confusion, fatigue, headaches, things that you might have anyway if your life has been disrupted by a disaster or a major storm. And so, especially in houses that don't have functional carbon monoxide indicators, this can be lethal and can kill multiple people in the same family. And so it's really important to be aware that generators need to run outside, and you need to make sure that's happening, not just for you, but for people around you who may not know about this problem. Next slide. Speaking of power outages, the other big thing to think about, whether it's for you or your family or your friends or your neighbors, is who is dependent on electricity that you know. Because one of the things that happens commonly in winter storms is the power goes out. And we've seen this just in the past year fairly frequently in eastern Massachusetts between big windstorms and other storms we've had just in the last few months. And when the power goes out, for some people, that is a minor annoyance. And for other people, that is life-threatening. And there are people at home who have battery-powered devices that help keep their heart beating. There are people at home who have oxygen concentrators that need to be plugged in order to concentrate oxygen so they can breathe. And there are a lot of people who need to run their nebulizer, need to refrigerate their insulin, need power. And so when the power goes out, these people are suddenly in a position of extraordinary medical vulnerability. Sometimes the solution to that is simply to go to the hospital and get services where we have access to big generators with a substantial fuel supply. But people don't always think to do that and may not have access to transportation. And so checking in on people in your lives who you know have conditions like this is a really worthwhile thing to do when you see that a storm is coming. And just say, hey, do you have a plan? What are you going to do if the power goes out? Next slide. So I'm going to close there. I'm happy to take more questions at the end. And this is my contact information if anyone wants to reach out and talk more about extreme weather and climate change and how these interact with our health today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caleb. With that, I will turn it over to, I just want to make sure that